One thing that seems crystal clear from my deep dive into transportation in Seattle last summer was, we're doing a lot of industry standard interventions in our streets that sound sensible, but the number of Seattleites killed and seriously injured in crashes is going up rather than down.
Well, that's Seattle Department of Transportation Director Greg Spots, who talked to me on a Patrons First podcast a few months ago about concerns over traffic fatalities in our city. So what's he doing about those concerns with a new draft of transportation plan released this week? Plus, another death toll of top concern in King County, the synthetic opioid fentanyl. What's behind the surge in deaths caused by this drug, and why does it continue to persist in the Northwest at a higher rate than other communities? Also, a shakeup in leadership for Mayor Bruce Harrell's administration. What impact will that have on not just one, but two local government agencies? Well, guess what? We are looking into these questions and so much more on Seattle News, Views, and Brews this week, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on Seattle Channel. The views expressed here are mine, all mine. And my co-host is none other than David Crowan, reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, I saw one of your posts recently about one of your favorite spots in the city of Seattle, a great place to ride a bike, to be sure. It looked like you're north of Myrtle Edwards Park on the Seattle waterfront. What is it about that spot?
Yeah, it's technically Expedia technically owns that little beach there. Mm-hmm. But the Elliott Bay Trail runs through there. It's just, especially if you're coming from Magnolia and you take that left turn toward downtown Seattle, it's sort of the first moment when the city and on a clear day, the mountain and the sound kind of all reveal themselves. And it's just a lovely scene.
It is a ta-da moment for sure coming into the city. Well, thank you, David, for that insight, and thank you for joining me once again. Also, a big thanks to City Grind Espresso, our background noise sponsor. They're on the first floor of City Hall. John, hope you're doing well. Thanks also to our show's patrons. This week's shout out is to our new patron, Steve. Thank you for jumping in at the $5 a month level there, Steve. Really appreciate it. We are working on sending Steve his very own Seattle News, Views, and Brews sticker. You can put this on the coffee cup, the computer. We've seen a lot of great photos of that, and we're hoping to soon see some photos of this decal in action, Steve. So get back to me on that. We feature your sticker shots, folks, on the video version of the podcast, which airs on Converge Media Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. Thank you, Converge, and thank you, Steve. All right, we're going to get started with right here, right now. And if you hear me sounding a little bit verklempt here, folks, I'm getting over a head cold, tested negative for COVID, so here's hoping for good things continuing there. David, I wanted to touch on this with the Seattle Transportation Plan, the vision, I should say, for Seattle's transportation future. It's on the docket this week for the City Council's Transportation and Utilities Committee as the council comes back from its 2-week recess. So there's an update to the draft of this plan after a year of outreach, 8,000 public comments, 9,000 responses to surveys, 75 public meetings and counting. There's a call for a new focus on safety, of course, underinvested communities, more affordable transit options, and plans are always great to put on paper. I think we've talked about this before, David, but my question to you is, what does this plan need to deliver for Seattle? I think it's an important test for Director Spots with the SDOT as he enters his second year in office there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the kind of most significant thing this plan does, at least for now, is, sort of consolidates SDOT's vision for the city and under one plan. There used to be a bunch of plans. Now there's one plan. That's fine and good. It's, I think it's also prerequisite to the next transportation levy, which will be voted on definitely in 2024. I don't know yet. I imagine November of 2024. Probably want to line it up with the presidential election to get good turnout. I suppose it could be August though. But anyway, so this sort of, is the groundwork for that, laying out some ideas for what might get funded in that and what some top priority projects will be. The obvious restriction on this is some of these are massively ambitious and long-term plans. Mm-hmm. And we have millions and millions of, if you combine Sound Transit and the state, we have billions in projects that have been funded and have been planned, and even those are having some troubles getting out the door and getting built. So, adding on top of it, these plans, it's every department needs a vision and long-term goals. At the same time, it's they're lofty, and how it goes from being words on a paper with some pretty presentations to actual projects that help people. There's quite a few steps in between.
Sure. No. And maybe just on that whole concept of how to pay for something like this, there's a separate conversation in this committee this week on transportation impact fees, meaning fees developers would pay to help create transportation infrastructure around their project. You want to build here? Well, put in a better sidewalk, pay for improvements on the bus stop, for example. And Councilmember Peterson, who heads up this committee on transportation, points out that 75% of people surveyed in Seattle think transportation impact fees are actually a good idea, and a few other cities around our area have them. Kent, Bellingham, just to name a few. And this is interesting to me, David. This could bring in somewhere in between $200 to $760 million over the next 10 years, according to the city. I think a lot about this and this transportation impact fees piece. How does that work in here? Is this something that you think the city could actually bring to fruition this year?
Yeah, I don't know what the political prospects are. I don't think it's going to have full buy-in from the whole council.
And there's going to be
Because
some new council members coming in too.
right. Because impact fees are sort of perennially a discussion in City Hall. It has been as long as I've been covering City Hall. I remember Mike O'Brien talking about them. Or
Yep.
The problem often tends to be is on the one hand, you have Councilmember Sawant saying, this is a tax on corporate developers who are reaping profits.
Yep.
On the other hand, we're in a housing crisis. There's a problem of speed of housing units getting online, and so the flip side to that is you're putting more cost and probably more time onto housing projects, and so
Yeah.
that is where impact fees tend to kind of end up dead. Councilmember Peterson and Councilmember Sawant have never had any. They don't have a lot of love for for-profit developers. And Councilmember Peterson has often, he's far from the most pro-density, pro-development council member on the dais, and so he kind of sees this as a fine trade-off. I think some of the more pro-density, pro-housing council members might be a little skeptical of this. So, I haven't been following it super closely, so I don't know how it's going to end up. But impact fees, there's a lot wrapped up when you talk about impact fees.
Oh, yeah. No, for sure. And I think it's an interesting conversation because you have people like Councilmember Herbold and Councilmember Peterson who don't always see eye to eye actually agreeing on something like this to head through to the next level. So we'll see what they talk about here. And this is important to listen to, folks, with transportation impact fees. This is something that can't be put towards, let's say, a bunch of potholes or something. It has to be for a future capital development there. And it also has to be used within 10 years on a public right of way. So this is something the council's working on. Again, put it against the backdrop of what's going on with the budget and some of the gaps they're looking at over the next couple of years. I'm looking forward to seeing what's happening with this conversation. But I wanted to touch on one more thing that the full council, is actually considering this week, David, that I thought was very interesting. This idea of putting lids over I-5. And I'm thinking about this around the downtown area. This is just a resolution at this point, so nothing binding the city to pay for anything just yet. But there's this advocacy group called Lid I-5 that really is getting the council's attention on this. Talk to me about this. What are these lids? Why would they be a good idea? What are the risks involved? This is something the council is apparently very interested in.
Yeah, it's a popular idea, especially among, there's a interesting consortium of people who are in favor of this. It's kind of an urbanist pedestrian transit advocate idea, but it's also a business Downtown Seattle Association and a lot of Capitol Hill businesses like the idea too, because theoretically it would kind of they've already been working hard to kind of bridge the gap between Capitol Hill and downtown with the pipeline project and the new convention center. This would be is seen as kind of a continuation of this, sort of a way of, because the fact of Boren and then the whole and then I-5 going through there has been kind of a thorn in the side of a lot of businesses because it cleaves the two busiest neighborhoods in the city in two. This theoretically could kind of bridge those two and create more flow. The obvious. Well, and I'll add also before I go to this skeptical sides,
Yeah.
lids are not uncommon. This isn't sort of a total pie in the sky idea. I mean,
Yeah.
a lid is under construction right now in Montlake.
Mm.
There's a few over 520. I mean, really, I mean, there's already a lid. I mean, there's Freeway Park is a lid
Right.
of
Right.
of sorts. So it's
On
not
I-5. Right.
I- it's over I-5. So I mean, this is a thing that can and has been done. It,
Hmm.
it is expensive. It's extremely expensive.
Yeah.
It is one of those issues where, as a reporter, you're never sure when to finally start taking it seriously, because
Right.
it has been studied and studied and studied. The legislature, it seems like every year, gives a little more money to study it more. This last year included. Um, a resolution is fine. A resolution doesn't bind anyone to anything.
Right.
So uh, again, this is one of those projects that yeah, I'm not counting it out at all. I think there's a real
No.
possibility can be done, but at a time when there are big budget concerns, I don't know what it will take to actually make this a reality.
Right. And that's the whole point of it, David. It wouldn't be just the city pumping money into this. It would be the state potentially as well. I mean, just the amount of coordination it would take for a project like this would be massive, I would imagine. And then how do you actually construct the thing and make sure you're safe for the drivers below and all that? I think there's just a lot of moving pieces to this. That coordination piece is a huge part of this too, right?
Yeah, definitely, because it's a state. There's whenever you're talking about highways and cities, there's always a lot of jurisdictions involved.
Right, right.
Um, y- you know, uh, I suppose if I had to sort of conjure like where you could get money for this thing, I could see maybe someone making an argument for climate commitment dollars. Uh,
Okay.
uh, that might be a stretch, perhaps, but that we're talking about impact fees, and there's just very few sources of revenue right
Yeah.
now that are large and going to exist for a long time. The exceptions right now of the sort of positive revenue streams are, we talked about the jumpstart tax. I
Yep.
don't see that being put to use here, but the Climate Commitment Act, which is basically selling carbon credits at the state
Hmm.
level, that is coming in way, way higher than anyone anticipated.
Right.
There's a lot of, obviously, it's a very controversial source of money, but it is coming in big. And so, if you were an advocate for Lit I-5 and looking for state money, perhaps you would think that making an argument that this is a or a climate friendly project
Yeah.
could perhaps increase your chances of getting some dollars for this thing.
Interesting thinking on that one, David. I'd love to see where they're going to find the dollars for this too, because you're right. This is a multi-billion-dollar project potentially that could potentially connect a lot of neighborhoods in Seattle and have some positive impact as well. So, thank you for that. All right, we're going to move next to a very important story: the fentanyl crisis. It continues to hit King County very hard. We're looking at a death toll that keeps on climbing. A closer look at what's going on coming up on Now Hear This. Well, some sobering news from King County over the last week. We still have about 4 months left in 2023, but deaths related to illicit fentanyl right now are at 704, just 8 away from the 2022 total of 712. So we're set to break a record here well before the year ends. And this is clearly a crisis local leaders have a sharp focus on. We heard from Mayor Harrell speaking about this back in June when he was wrangling with the city council over its new drug use and possession ordinance.
It's about the health crisis playing out right in front of our eyes and the people suffering and dying from a new kind of poison, and how those elements combined all together make our neighbors feel unsafe and unwelcome.
It is a public safety and a public health crisis all at once here, David. And the numbers get even scarier, I think, when you see, as reported in the Seattle Times, that 83% of the confirmed drug deaths in King County are now coming from fentanyl, compared to 71% in 2022. Huge question, I know, but I just wanted to get your take on this continued spike in cases. What's your take on what's going on here and why this continues to increase?
Yeah, it is a huge question. My take is fentanyl is now the baseline drug, and it's showing up in. I mean, it's taken the place of heroin almost completely, but it's also showing up
Yeah.
in methamphetamine and cocaine,
Yep.
and so it's just so pervasive. I think I read that something like 6 in 10 doses contain a lethal amount if you're
Right.
looking at those pills. That is insane. That's so
Yeah.
high. Um, the fact that it's cheap, the fact that the high does not last very long, um, all of these things have added up to, I mean, just the crisis that it is right now.
Yeah.
You can drill further down into policy, and I don't really know enough about the facts and the data of what's actually behind this to weigh in on that. But what I do know
Yeah.
is just, some of that feels a little bit like nibbling around the edges when you're talking about the sort of just how awash
Yeah.
really everywhere is in fentanyl, and just such a different thing than regular heroin or regular cocaine.
Hmm. Yeah, just in terms of what you're talking about there, it really doesn't take much. I've been working on a documentary about this with the Seattle channel. We're talking about 2 tiny grains of this. I mean, that could basically fit on the point of a pencil, that can be deadly. And it's not entirely clear what's in these illicit pills that people are getting on the streets, but clearly that dose, at least from what I've heard from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, those numbers are increasing. So that's the other part of it that's really interesting, David. What we're seeing in, or what law enforcement is seeing in these pills that are on the street, that actual dosage is getting higher and higher of fentanyl in the pill, which it means 2 things. One, that they're trying to respond, I guess. The drug dealers are responding to the people on the street and giving them more and more of a high and kind of getting them more and more addicted. But also for people that might be experiencing this drug for the first time, it can kill very quickly. It can kill the first time around. And so I'm with you. I think the policy piece is really difficult to break down. And I also think about what's happening with King County trying to make something happen with its walk-in clinics here. Again, focused on behavioral health and these sorts of things, and drug dependency is a piece of that. This crisis care levy that we approved in King County this year, voters did in April of this year. It's just one of these situations where I don't think you can get these facilities open soon enough. The resources that are needed public health wise just are nowhere near matching the need right now. That's another piece of this too, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's objectively true.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much there's behind this, but even you think about safe consumption sites, or
Mm,
that was seen as kind of one way of responding to heroin crisis. But even that, it's like, well, you're just talking about popping a pill in your mouth. It's like, I'd be curious to know. I mean, would people even use those at this point? Because
right.
it used to be you would need, you'd maybe want to go and get clean needles, or uh, you know, be around. It's more of a process. But now it's just
Right,
putting
right.
a pill on your tongue, and that's that. I mean, I think it's getting, in addition to the potency and the availability becoming harder and harder. I think uh, creating contacts with people who are struggling with this probably
Right.
is getting more difficult too. I don't know
Right.
that for sure.
No, no, but you make a really good point there about just the ease of use of this drug, and the
Yeah.
other piece of it that I've heard from some of the people who are working on the street with this, it's a pill that literally costs $1 or less right now. And so when you think about that factor, and then you think about the lack of support after, and you're right, it doesn't take that much time to actually pop a pill like this. And some people are doing that, a couple of times an hour. And I don't know, it's a frightening situation. And I talked about resources and where they're coming from, and I would urge people. I am working on this documentary with the Seattle channel. It's slated to come out later this month in November. I'll talk about it again on the podcast because I think it's important to check it out. And yeah, it's just one of those things, David, where I know you've covered different issues in the city for a while. This one just keeps on rising and rising in terms of its prevalence and its connection to so many other issues here. I just really noticed that it's something really palpable within city policy, state policy right now.
And it just feels, I mean, I don't know. It just feels a little, I don't want to use the word hopeless, but
Mm,
I just haven't
yeah,
seen, I haven't seen or heard of some example of some city somewhere getting its hands around this
right.
in a meaningful way. I mean, it's just, I, you know, I don't know what it takes to actually slow this down.
Yeah, and I hate to say it, there are a number of law enforcement officials that are working hard on this, and treatment specialists too. That I won't say they feel hopeless, but they certainly feel overwhelmed at this case with the amount of cases that we're dealing with. So, thank you for talking with me about that, David. A very difficult subject indeed. But I wanted to talk about another headline that you folks may have missed at the lull at the end of summer here, a bit of a power shakeup in the mayor's office here. So we're talking about Sam Cho, the president of the Port of Seattle Commission. He's now joining the mayor's office as director of strategic initiatives. This is part of the fallout from Deputy Mayor Manisha Harrell, the mayor's niece, who announced she would step down from her role back in June. And David, I thought this was very interesting because it appears Sam Cho will keep his commission role, but also start working on revitalizing downtown with Mayor Harrell. And quoting from the mayor's press release, Cho would, quote, recuse himself when potential conflicts of interest arise between the port and the city. Is this a little weird, or is this just me? What do you see out of this?
No, it's not just you. The port, you think of just the water, container ships coming in or out, but the port is much bigger than that. I mean, especially when you're talking about downtown Seattle. We saw it a couple months ago with the whole bike lane by the cruise ship. I mean, that, in the grand scheme of things, isn't like existential, but it's like this. It took them a year and a half to figure out like a design for a bike lane on the waterfront that satisfied the Port of Seattle and the City of Seattle. The port and the city are two different jurisdictions, and they generally work okay together, but sometimes they come in conflict with each other. And we see it a lot too when we're talking about street design and freight. I think freight and sort of some of the freight and sort of safety advocates find themselves a lot of times at loggerheads with one another because there's like concerns about where the trucks are going to go and how the roads are going to suit them. So I suppose he'll be able to recuse himself, but this stuff is pretty intertwined at a lot of levels. And so if I'm Wayne Barnett at the Ethics and Elections Commission, I imagine there are going to be quite a few check-ins with Sam Cho.
I would imagine so too. And it's interesting to think about Sam Cho, because I think you might have interacted with him a couple of weeks ago when there was that announcement about the public-private partnership working on that bike path going down the waterfront, connecting the parks there on Elliott Bay. He's just kind of come across to me, Cho has, as a more public voice from an agency, the port, which doesn't always have that headline spot, when it comes to public policy. Does this elevate the work and maybe add more scrutiny to the work of the port as well in terms of him becoming a member of the mayor's cabinet?
Yeah, I don't know what it does for the port exactly. It's interesting. I mean, the port, I think, used to be seen as more of a kind of stepping stone into something else. It was technically a part-time job. I imagine if you talk to port commissioners, it's probably not actually a part-time job.
Yeah, no kidding.
But so I mean, I think maybe this is indicative of the fact that the port, I just don't think, has the attention that maybe it used to. I don't know that it's actually seen as that much of a stepping stone anymore. So maybe working for the mayor kind of rounds out Sam Cho's. I don't know Sam Cho.
Yeah.
I've talked to him a couple times. I don't know anything about his ambitions or what he wants for the future. But if you're trying to, if you're looking at your resume and you're trying to pad a little bit, strategic advisor to mayor in addition to president of the Port of Seattle is a little more meaty. So again, pure speculation. See. I don't know where it goes from here.
No, I hear you. There's political machinations going on here. There's these two agencies working together. So I'm interested, I guess I would say, to see what comes up next. And this was just a very interesting choice. And we'll see how that works out in terms of the downtown activation plan, which is still in process, I would say, for the city of Seattle. All right, well, coming up, we have talked about traffic fatalities in the city of Seattle. Unfortunately, a situation that is playing out statewide here as well. David's got the story next on Transportation Talk. David, you had a piece recently in the Times, it was actually just over this past Labor Day weekend, that traffic deaths statewide are trending even higher than last year's mark of 750 deaths, which was the highest amount our state has had since 1990. And your piece came out just as there was a big crash that injured 7 people in Seattle on Monday morning. This weekend of Labor Day weekend has turned into one of the most deadly for our state, unfortunately. But I just wanted to talk about this bigger picture here. What is going on when it comes to these traffic deaths? What are you finding in these numbers?
Well, I mean, a few things. It's I think a lot of experts and people who work in this field are still honestly trying to wrap their head around what's going on because
Hmm.
when COVID happened, the first assumption was we're going to see traffic deaths go down because not that many people are
Right.
driving. The opposite happened, and so then the theory became there were fewer people on the roads, people could drive faster.
Mm.
Okay, that makes sense. And then as traffic has returned and, by most measures is pretty back to normal,
Hmm.
those deaths have not gone down again. They've continued to go up. And so um, the kind of general thought is it's just a combination of things. I think um, enforcement, traffic enforcement is still way down.
Yeah,
And there's a certain sector of people, particularly Republicans and at the state level, are that's kind of their focus is we need to bring more officers and increase traffic enforcement.
sure.
Um, on a more zoomed out scale, cars are getting heavier, so crashes. An interesting thing is total number of crashes hasn't actually gone up that much, but the
Right.
crashes are just proving to be deadlier, which it's likely a combination of speed and the size of the cars,
Right.
and then distractions, cell phones, drug impairment are
Yeah.
playing big factors still, and so hard to kind of put it at one thing, but yeah, really discouraging that it's a trend that is continuing.
Right, and you were talking about adding officers or whatever else. The legislature is trying to put some dollars into this in their transportation package from last year, $17 billion, if I'm reading this right here, had this whole idea that we need to improve things for cars and also really try to help out walkers and bicyclists as well. Because I wanted to bring that up because I think that's an important piece of this. It's not just people in cars who are getting hurt here. We've definitely seen it in Seattle. We've seen these people on foot, on bikes getting hurt as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes even a little bigger, which is just the way that a lot of our roads are designed and have been built for many years.
Mm.
Um, there's it's interesting. I mean, it's a lot of highways. I think about Highway 7 in Pierce County a lot,
Yeah, yeah.
Pacific Highway, which once upon a time used to be basically this big highway between suburban communities.
Mhm.
Um, it's no longer between suburban communities; it's now through them because
Yep.
development and growth has been so big. And one of few places that density is allowed in our cities is along these. They call them transit oriented development because they're near
Sure.
buses or whatever, but oftentimes it ends up being along big arterial roads,
Yep.
roads that are once upon a time were just considered highways, and so therefore you have a
Mhm.
lot more people with a lot more opportunities to get hit by a car, and so that I think is also a big factor. None of these are singular or necessarily
Yeah.
easy. I think the focus of the legislature and politicians generally has been kind of more on trying to police individual behavior, like
Right.
automated enforcement and bringing
Yep.
on new officers, mostly because that's what can be done and perhaps make a difference in a year rather than confronting some of the bigger problems, which are that we've allowed growth to happen in the most dangerous places.
Yeah. That structural piece of it is huge. Well, thank you, David. I know that's a story that you're continuing to follow, so I look forward to see what's going on there. But it is time to wrap up, and I guess I need to ask this question, David. What are you more afraid of this month in September for the Mariners? Is it the Astros or the COVID pandemic? What do you got?
Yeah, I don't know. I just seems like everybody I know has COVID, so I keep expecting to hear it ripping through the Mariners clubhouse. Hasn't happened
Yeah,
yet. But you gotta. I don't know. The Astros are suddenly well, except for last week they got swept by the Yankees. But up until
that was
then, they
cool.
were starting to look like the Astros again. So I don't
Hmm.
know. I'm more scared
Yeah.
of the Astros than I am the Rangers. I'll say that.
Yeah, yeah, I'm so interested to see how this last month of the season goes, but, I know we're gonna keep track of that one too, David, so we got a lot ahead here riding on this fall. So thank you, sir, as always, for joining me here. Thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's brewing in local politics. This podcast is on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you listen. please make sure you find Seattle News, Views, and Brews. Also, check us out on Patreon. This is an important way to show your support, and we really appreciate that. Thank you for watching on Converge Media 2. We will see you next time.
Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2023.